Hello, Levittown Library patrons and anyone else who might be watching. My name is Mr. Christian, and I would like to welcome you to this introduction to coding. The purpose of this video is to introduce you to the world of coding and to show you that coding can be very fun, creative, and not that hard. If you've never done any coding before, then this video is perfect for you. Also, if you are a beginner at coding, you will definitely learn some things as well, especially since we will be touching on some game design concepts and on how to create usable programs. The coding language we are going to use today is called Python. Python is one of the most popular programming languages and also a pretty simple one to learn, so it's great for beginner coders. There are two ways to get Python. One, you can download and install it to your computer. Just go to python.org, then go to Downloads. They have versions for Windows, Mac, and others. Download the right version and install it on your computer. Or you can code through your browser by going to a website called replit.com. That's replit.com. Create a free account and then just click on Python under Create, and we are off and running. Feel free to pause the video here so you can get yourself set up and follow along, and I will see you in a minute. So what are we doing today? We are going to create a text-based adventure game. The idea is that we are creating this game for a user to play. It's basically like a choose-your-own-adventure book, if any of you have ever read one of those. The player will have various choices and challenges, and the outcome of the story will be decided based on what they choose. At the end of the video, we will also touch on creating a role-playing game, or RPG. If any of you have ever played a RPG video game, like Undertale or any of the Final Fantasy games, that's kind of what we're going for, but just with text. So for this video, I'll be using replit.com. Once I start a Replit, I can type my code in here. I can hit run when I'm ready, and the output will appear here in the console. Kind of like Google Docs, it will save automatically for you as you go. If you want to code on your computer, you can start out by clicking on Python and clicking on idle here. You'll see the shell will appear. Just go to File and New File. You could start coding here and click Save or click Run when you're ready to try it out. When you click Run, it'll have you save the file, create a new name for it, and then the output will appear in the shell. Okay, so what we want is a program that will display text. So how do we do that? We are going to type print, and when you do that, you should see it'll change color. That means that it has some significance for Python. It's not just any word. So we're going to say print and then open parentheses, and then we are going to put the message that we want to print in quotes. So let's try hello world. And I'm sure if you've ever done a coding class before, this is probably how they started. So we're putting that in quotes. We're going to close the parentheses, and I'm going to go to run, and let's see what this does. Okay, and it displays our text exactly as we typed it. Okay, so we're supposed to be creating an adventure game, though, and that's not very exciting, so let's try this. You wake up in a strange forest. As you stand up, groggy and unsteady, you take in your unfamiliar surroundings. The forest is dense and humid. You realize you have no memory of how you got here. As you walk around, trying to find something recognizable, you suddenly hear a horrible sound. You see an orc emerge from behind a tree. The creature has green skin, huge tusks, and stands over 6 feet tall. It roars and charges towards you. What do? Alright, so if you don't know, by the way, an orc from Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, or a variety of other games like Dungeons and Dragons, is a large, monstrous, savage, humanoid type creature as described here. So this being a computer game or video game technically, we need to give the player some options. So I'm going to make another print statement now. And I'm basically going to give the player a multiple choice option here. So I'm going to say A, run away. Seems smart. B, pick up a rock and throw it at the orc. or C. Point and yell, "Look over there," then slip away while the orc is distracted. So now if I hit run, you'll see it'll print the whole beginning statement and then the multiple choice here. Now the problem I'm having here, keep in mind we're creating this for a player to play. This is pretty unreadable. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the beginning of my print statement, and within the quotes I'm going to put \n. Hopefully you'll see that'll turn a slightly different color. That's good. And that says to print the statement on a new line. So that'll separate things nicely. And I'm actually going to separate all my choices that way. Putting \n over here and over here. And I think for the rest of this program, I'm just going to start all my print statements with the \n. I think that'll just make it look nice for the user and just be a simple way of doing it for me. So now let's see here. That's good there. I'm happy with that. That's easy to read. It's easy to tell what's happening. And just be mindful of your spaces because it will print all the spaces that you put within the quotes as well. So for example, if I did that, that would look slightly off there. So just be aware of that. So we want the player to have some input here, right? So how do we do that? So we're going to use the input function. The way input works is we have to choose what the input will be called. You can choose whatever you want. I'm going to call it choice. You say choice equals input. So input is a function like print. It has to have these parentheses. We can leave the parentheses blank, but similar to print, we can put a message in the parentheses that will be displayed when the program asks the user for input. And I'm going to do that here. I'm going to use these arrows here. And I'm just going to do that whenever I use input. And that way, whenever the user sees that in the program, they're going to know that the program is just waiting for their input. So this is what it'll look like here. So now normally when you run a program, it's going to go through each line, run each line as fast as it can. When it gets to input though, the program is just going to pause and wait for the user's input. Okay, so now we have a way for the user to interact with the program. We ask them to choose one of these three options, and each one will have a different outcome. So looking at these options as the game designer, I'm going to decide that running away is pretty smart in this situation. The other two options will lead to the player's demise. They will lose the game. So we are going to make this happen using conditionals. We're going to tell the program, if choice, remember that's what we called the input, if choice is A, then the program will move on to the next part of the adventure. But if it's not A, then the game will be over. So we're using the conditional if. You should see the word if change color there. That's good. We want to say the choice, the input called choice, is A. Unfortunately, we cannot use the equal sign because the equal sign is used for creating variables, like up here. So what we do is we use double equals, A. And the way we say then is using a colon. Now in Python, indentations are very important. They have meaning. We're going to hit enter after the colon, and you'll see that the next line will automatically indent for us. So this is what's going to happen if the condition choice is A will be met. So here we are going to put a new print statement. And this is going to move us on to the next part of the adventure. The orc is chasing after you. As you run, you notice a nearby cave. Do you go inside? Yes or no? Okay, so currently this says, if the choice is A, then print the following. And now we want to say, if the choice is not A, then do something else. And we do that with the word else. Make sure else is on the same line as if. You'll see it again turn blue. That's good. And then colon, else, do the following. So we're going to have a separate print statement here. And we'll say, let's say, the orc is too powerful. Game over. Okay, I'm going to test this out now. I'm going to hit run. Our adventure starts up. We're going to try to run away. And it looks like we got an error. Let's see. Okay, the program is telling us, hey, I don't know what A is. You didn't tell us what A is. So we do need to be specific here that we do just mean letter A. In Python, letters and words and sentences are called strings. We need to be specific here that we mean just the letter A, a string that just consists of A. And we do that by putting it in quotes, same as when we make a print statement. So now let's try it. Okay. All right, looks good. We've gotten to the next part of our adventure. Let's run it again here. I'm going to try something else other than A, and good. Game over. Okay. So far, this game is seeming a little harsh to me. Maybe I want throwing a rock to work now. It seems like it could be heroic and exciting. So now I want both A and B to succeed. I want both of them to advance us to the next part of the game, to the next level, if you will. So it says, if choice is A, do this. Otherwise, do this. Now I want it to say, if choice is not A, but it is B, then do this. Otherwise, game over. So the way we do that is else if, E-L-I-F. Again, you'll see it turn the same color as the other conditionals. Else if choice is B. Then, now how can I get B to do the same thing as A? Well, I could copy and paste it, right? I'll copy this, I'll paste it there, but oh no, I've just noticed I have a typo here. So that means I have to fix it in both spots, right? That's fine, I only have two, but imagine if we were making a more complicated program at this point. Maybe we had 10 different options. If we noticed a typo, now we would have to go and fix it in all 10 spots. That would be very time consuming. So I don't really like that option. And this brings us to a pretty important topic in coding, and that's efficiency. As you learn coding and you start making your own programs, you might find that there are certain programs that you can't code, not because you don't know how, but because it would take you way too long. So for many reasons, finding efficient ways to code is very important and is primarily how you're going to increase your skill in coding. So for example, in this adventure that we're creating, I want it to go on for several more levels. I don't want to have to repeat each level, type it all out multiple times for each choice that I have, each successful choice that I want there to be. So we are going to solve this using functions. Functions are pretty important in coding, and functions are going to allow us to do a lot of cool things to improve this program. We've already been using some functions, such as print and input. These functions are built into Python, but now we are going to make our own. First, before we continue the adventure, I don't like how the program just ends when you lose. Have you ever played a video game that just shuts down when you lose? No, there's usually a game over screen, right? It might tell you why you lost, and it will offer to start the game again at some point, right? So that's what we're going to do. We're going to create a function that acts as our game over screen. So the way we create a function or define a function is with the letters DEF. We put DEF, and then we are going to name our function. I'm going to call it game_over. Whenever you create it or use a function, you have to use these parentheses. What goes inside the parentheses is called an argument, and it allows you to do something different every time you use the function. You don't have to use an argument, you can simply leave it blank. But in this case, what I want to do is create a game over screen that does the same thing each time, but the one difference is that it gives you a different reason every time we use the game over function. So inside the parentheses, I'm going to put reason. That's what we're going to call this particular argument. Then, just like the if statement, we're going to use a colon, And now underneath there, we are going to decide what this function does. And if this part is a bit confusing, by the way, I think it'll become clearer once we start using the functions, but just bear with me for now. So what this function is going to do is it's going to print the reason that we gave as to why the player lost the game. I'm going to make sure that's a new line, and then it's going to print the reason. So it's going to print the reason, and then it'll print game over in all caps, very obnoxious. And then it will ask the player if they want to play again, yes or no. So you'll notice here that we put something in our print statement which is not a string, that is not a series of letters or numbers or words, but is in fact the argument here, which is totally fine. So now whenever we use the game over function, it will print the reason that we give. Again, I'll show you how that works in just a moment. But first, we're asking the player if they want to play again. So this is another situation where we're going to use input. I'm going to call this one replay equals input. And again, I'm going to use those 3 arrows just to let the player know that we're waiting for their input. We're asking them yes or no. So if replay is Y for yes, then what are we going to do? So then we want the game to start over. But how does the program know where to start? How does it know where the beginning of the program is? Well, we are going to make the beginning of the program its own function. So I'm going to go back to the top here, and I'm going to make a new function, def. I'm going to call this starts game. For this one, I don't think we need an argument. I still need to put those parentheses, but I'm just going to leave them blank. I'm going to put a colon, and now I'm just simply going to indent this whole thing. And now, everything we've done so far, that is start game. That's the start game function. So now, going back to the game over screen, if the player puts in Y, then what do? We start game. That's all I have to do. I put in the start game function, making sure to include the empty parentheses. And I think I could just leave it like that. If the player doesn't put in Y, then the program will end. That's fine. Okay, so now we want to use the game over function when the player chooses something other than A and B, right? So for else, instead of this print statement, we are going to use our new game over function. So I put in the name of it, game over. Now I'm going to add a reason. The player chose C at this point, so I'm going to say, you are not as good of an actor as you thought. And now same as the print function, I'm putting that in quotes because it is a string. And you may have guessed here that each level is going to be its own function. So we're going to get to that in a bit. But for now, we've done a lot here, so let's test this out, see if our program is doing what we want it to. Okay, so I'm going to click run, and nothing happened. That's because all our program is doing right now is defining a bunch of functions. It doesn't actually do anything, but that's easy to fix. We just come to the bottom here after all our functions have been defined, and we start the game. Now, let's see. Awesome, our game started. Our adventure has begun. I'm going to try out C, and I lost. You are not as good of an actor as you thought. Game over. Play again? Yes. Let's try again. And there we go. We started at the beginning. Perfect. So now you see how this function is working here. The reason is the argument, and when we put our string into the argument there in between the parentheses, whatever we're putting in there is being plugged in to this print statement where we told the program to put the reason in. Okay, so I'm feeling pretty good about this program now, but I'm also mindful that this is a game that I'm intending for other people to play. I want it to be fun. And there's one problem I'm having, which I think makes the program not as fun. You may have noticed that Python is case sensitive. If I'm choosing capital A as the choice, as the answer, then the player has to put in the capital A, otherwise things will not go as planned. So I'm going to solve that problem using lists. A list is a type of variable that contains multiple things, And I realize I've only mentioned variables in passing, so let me explain them now. They're pretty simple. A variable allows you to store any kind of data. To demonstrate, I'm going to make a variable called greeting. So let me get rid of that. Greeting equals. You can always name them whatever you want. I like to include a capital letter whenever I make a variable, because if I accidentally make a variable that has the same name as, say, a function or some other operator, that could cause problems. So what does greeting equal? We're going to have it equal a string. The string will be hello world. Should look familiar. So now in my program, this is what greeting means. So if I make a print statement, it says print greeting. Let's see what happens. And it prints hello world. So that's the idea. Let's put this back the way it was. So now we're going to make a list. So our program has multiple choice questions, and it also has yes or no questions. So what I want to do is, for each answer, I'm going to make a list that contains all the ways I think the average player would answer. Okay, so for answer A, I'm going to make a variable. I'm going to call it answer A equals. Now to make the list, I'm going to use the brackets. So I'm going to do open bracket. And how do I want them to be able to answer? Well, capital A is good, and lowercase a is good. So wherever I have A, choice A, I'm going to change this to answer A, to my variable, my list, that contains both the uppercase and lowercase a. Now, I don't want to say equals, because then the player would have to put in both capital A and lowercase a. What I want to say is that if the choice is within answer A, one of the things within A, then do the following. So instead of equals, I will say if choice in answer A. Let's try that out. Okay, so I'm going to do lowercase a, and it works. It does what I want it to do. Excellent. So now I'm just going to do the same thing with the other possible answers. So we have answer B, capital B, lowercase b, answer C, capital C, lowercase c. Now I also have yes and no questions, right? So let's do yes answer equals. Now, what do we want to accept? Maybe the player types in yes, that's fine. Or with the lowercase. And notice how I'm separating each item within the list with a comma. Now you can put as many things as you want within this list. And I'm going to do that now. Capital Y, lowercase y. What else is okay? How do I think the player will respond? Sure. Yepers. And now answer no. Lowercase no. Capital N, lowercase n. Nah. I'm good. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and fix these choices. This answer yes. Now the way we set it up before is we assume that if the player did not choose A and did not choose B, then they chose C. But let's see here. What if the player just makes a typo? What if they just do something other than A and B? What happens? Well, it looks like they get answer C, which is not really what we want. So what we're going to do is we're going to create another else if for C. Else if choice is in answer C. Then the game over will happen with the correct reason. Now, if they don't choose A or B or C, then obviously they've made a mistake. So we are going to make a print statement which tells the player choose one of the three options. And then what's going to happen is the game will restart, or at least this section will restart. So let's see. Okay, our game starts. I make a typo, and it tells me to choose one of the three options, and then everything restarts. Excellent. Okay, I'm feeling pretty good about this, and I think it's finally time to move on with the adventure. Remember, choice A and choice B will successfully move the player onto the next level. The next level we are going to call Orb Chase. That's going to be a new function. Okay, so if the player chooses A, they choose to run away, we're going to give them a statement that says, you run away, but the orc is chasing after you. Then we're going to call the next function, which I will call Orb Chase. Now remember, I haven't made this function yet, so if I try to run things now, I'll get an error. But I know what I want to call it, so I'm just going to put it in there now so I don't forget later. Similarly, if the player chooses to throw a rock, we're going to say, your rock hits the orc in the head. It is momentarily stunned, giving you a chance to escape. And that will also lead to Orb Chase. Okay, so now I'm going to create the Orb Chase function, which is the next part of the adventure. So def Orb Chase. So when the player gets to this part, they will see the following. The orc is chasing after you. As you run, you notice a nearby cave. Do you go inside? Yes or no? So we're going to create another input here. Choice equals input. Again, we're going to put our arrows. Then if choice is yes, that is, if it's in our yes list, then we move on to the next part of the adventure, which is called cave. If they choose no, however, then it's game over. The reason? The orc catches up to you and mauls you. Ouch. So the next part of the adventure is going to be the next function, which we've named cave. So let's do def cave. And what happens here? You go into the cave looking for a place to hide. As you look around in this dark cavern, you notice something shiny on the ground. It's a sword. Do you pick it up? Yes or no? So this choice will actually not determine whether the player advances or not. The player will advance either way, but we want a way for the program to know whether the player has a sword or not. That might matter in the next part of the adventure. So we are going to store that information using a variable. We're going to make a new variable called sword. And since the player starts out with 0 swords, we are going to set sword equal to 0. Now, as usual, we will make a new input. Choice equals input. Then, if choice is a yes answer, we want to add 1 to sword. Now we could say sword equals 1. That would change sword from whatever it is to 1. But maybe in a different part of our program, we'll decide that there's another opportunity to pick up a sword. So we may not know exactly how many swords the player has. So we want to add 1 to whatever sword is. The way we do that is sword plus equals 1. That's basically shorthand for sword equals sword plus 1. So let's try this out and see how things are going. Okay. Program started up. I'm going to run away. I'm going to go into the cave. I'm going to pick up the sword. And oh no, I got an error. So there's a bit of a wrinkle here that has to do with how functions work in Python. When you create a variable like this is called a global variable because it defines sword for the entire program. But when you use variables within functions, by default it assumes that it is what's called a local variable, which means that the variable is defined by the function and is only used by the function. So what we need to do is we need to bring in this global variable into our function. That's quite simple. All we need to do is start it out. We'll say global sword, and that brings the global sword variable into our function. That way we can change it, we can do what we want with it, and then that way other functions can also use the sword variable after we've changed it or added to it. Okay, next I want to make a print statement that tells the player how many swords they have. This way the player gets some feedback, and also for us, the programmers, this will help us know that our program is working the way we want it to. So the print statement will start out with a string. It'll say number of swords. Then we're going to add to that the sword variable. By using a comma, our print statement will print both of these. So let's test it out. Try the rock this time. Go into the cave. Pick up the sword. And there we go, number of swords. I picked up the sword, and so now I have one sword. Quickly, let's try it again, and this time we won't pick up the sword. No. Number of swords, 0. Perfect. So no matter what happens with the sword, the adventure will continue to the next part, which we will call Orc Fight. So we'll make our next function, calling it Orc Fight. Now what happens here? Let's see. The orc catches up to you. What do you do? A. Fight. B. Run. Or C. Negotiate. And again, notice how we're putting our \n's in between each, so that they're printed on a new line and easy to read. So let's go ahead and set up our input and our 3 outcomes. So the first one will be A. Now, if the player chooses to fight, it kind of makes a big difference whether they have a sword, doesn't it? So let's bring in the global sword variable into this function. Okay, so our if statement says if they chose answer A, then we want the outcome to depend on whether they have a sword. So how do we do that? Well, we can simply put another if statement here. So this will say if choice is A and if the player has a sword. So how do we indicate whether the player has a sword or not? What matters is that they have at least one, right? So we will say if sword is greater than 0. So if the choice is answer A and sword is greater than 0, then that'll move us on to the next part of the adventure, which will be the last part. But if the choice is A, but the player does not have a sword, then it'll be game over. Okay, so if sword is greater than 0, here's what'll happen. The orc lunges at you as you desperately strike with your sword. You plunge the sword into the creature's chest, killing it. And that'll bring us to the last part, which is called Fairy Riddle. So now we'll do else. So if it's not greater than 0, game over. You are defenseless. The orc easily kills you. So that covers choice A. Choice B will not work. That will result in a game over as well. So we'll do our else if, ELIF. Choice is in answer B. You are too winded. The orc catches you and mauls you. Game over. So that's answer B. And finally, answer C. What'll happen here? Well, I'm going to choose to make this depend on the sword as well. So again, we're going to do else if choice is in answer C. And again, if sword is greater than 0, here's what'll happen. The orc takes your shiny new sword and agrees to leave you alone. But this will result in the player losing their sword. You will type sword minus equals 1. You will lose 1 sword. And then, just like the previous function, we're going to print the number of swords the player has now, so that the player knows, and also so that the programmers know. I could just go ahead and copy this from here. And that will move us on to the last part as well. Fairy Riddle. But if there is no sword, if sword is not greater than 0, it's game over again. You have nothing to offer, and the orc is not in a talking mood. Okay, before we move on here, let's add an else at the end. So this will be if the player does not choose A, B, or C. If that happens, they will get an error message, and then we will restart the current function, orc fight. So print choose one of the 3 options, and then the orc fight function. Okay, this will bring us to the last part of the adventure. The last function we are going to make, I've decided to call Fairy Riddle. So let's go ahead and define that. Okay, so here's what'll happen. You emerge from the cave, catching your breath, having survived the orc. You notice a small glowing thing with wings approach you. A fairy flutters about and speaks to you, saying, "Greetings. I can't believe you survived the orc. I will help you escape the enchanted forest if you can answer my riddle. In order to keep this, you must first give it. What is it?" Can you guess the answer? Well, let's see. First off, notice how I'm using the single quotes here for the fairy. That's because the double quotes would end our string, which is not what we want. Okay, so I think you've seen how we could make an input that simply requires the player to put in the right answer. But I'm going to be nice, and I'm going to make this multiple choice. So we'll make another print statement, and we'll give the player choices. A, $100. B, a promise. Let's see. C, a newspaper. That's the wrong riddle. And D, I like cheese. Can you guess the right answer now? It is, in fact, B. You must first give a promise before you can keep one. So this is the last part of the adventure. We're going to set up our input, and if the player answers B, they will win the game. Otherwise, it'll be game over. So we'll set up our input. Choice equals input. Put in our arrows. Then if choice is in answer B, they win, else game over. Now if the player wins the game, again, we don't want the program to simply shut down. Why don't we give them a chance to play again, just like in the game over function. So we're going to print, the fairy laughs and there is a flash of light. As your eyes clear, you find that you have been returned to the real world. You have survived the enchanted forest. Now we'll create an option, another input. Let's type replay equals input. Play again. Yes or no. And just like the game over function, if replay is in the yes answer, then we will restart the game by running the start game function. And we can leave it like that. If they answer anything other than yes, then the program will shut down, which is fine. Now, if the player put in something other than answer B, then the game will be over. So we'll put in else, game over. You are wrong. The fairy abandons you and you are forced to wander the enchanted forest for the rest of your life. Just something to keep in mind here. We're creating these functions with a little bit more complicated logic, so we need to keep track of the indentations. For example, this else statement, just make sure that it's on the same line as the if here. So there we have it. Let's go ahead and try running this. Okay, we wake up in the strange forest, we get attacked by the orc. I'm going to throw a rock. We hit the orc with the rock. I'm going to go in the cave, pick up the sword. I have one sword. What do? I'm going to negotiate. The orc has taken my sword. I have 0 swords. The fairy's riddle. I will choose B. Fairy laughs. There's a flash of light. It looks like we have won. We've escaped the enchanted forest. Let's play again. And we did it. We're playing again. So there we have it. We have a text-based adventure game. Now, before we end things today, there's a few other things I wanted to show you. I'd like to show you some ways that we can make this game more fun, and some game design concepts that I think will be pretty cool and interesting. Now, once a player plays through this a few times, they'll go through all the options, they'll know what happens, and that'll be it. One fun way to make the game more replayable is to introduce randomness. If we have some random elements to our game, then things will be less predictable. Could be more suspenseful, exciting. Both the player and the programmer will not be sure what's going to happen. So how do we do that in Python? Python comes with a lot of built-in functions. For example, we've been using print and input, and it also has a lot of other functions as well. But it doesn't automatically load all of its functions every time you make a program, because that would just bog things down. So some of the functions, such as random, we have to tell the program to bring that in. It doesn't do it automatically, but that's pretty simple. We're going to go up to the top, and we're going to start our program by typing import random. So now we can use the random function. So let's look at the start of our game here. Now, instead of deciding for the player which option will succeed and which will fail, I'm going to make it random whether or not their choice succeeds or fails. We're going to think of this like rolling a die. Like when you play a board game, you roll a die to see what happens. That's what we're going to do here. First, let's demonstrate how the random function works. Let me get rid of this for now. And I'm going to create a variable that rolls a die. So I'm going to call it roll equals, I'm going to use the random function. Now there are a lot of different types of random. The one I want is called randint. So this is going to be random.randint. That stands for random integer. If we don't use that, then we'll get a bunch of decimal places, which is not what we want. An integer, as you know, is a whole number. So then in parentheses, in the argument, we're going to put the range that we want. And since I'm thinking of die rolling, I'm going to use 1 and 6. You can put in whatever you want. If you're a Dungeons & Dragons player, you can do 1 to 20, like a 20-sided die. Then I'm going to make a print statement that prints the roll variable. Now let's see what happens. 1. I'm just going to hit run a bunch of times. And you see I'm getting a random number between 1 and 6. So let's put this back the way it was. Okay, so let's look at our start game function. And we are going to randomize the outcomes of these choices. First, before the choice occurs, we are going to roll a die. We are going to do that by making a variable called roll. Roll equals random.randint. And again, we're just going to use 1 to 6 for fun. So the idea is certain results will lead to a success and certain results will fail. So let's start with choice A. I'm going to choose to make this a 50-50 chance of success. The way I'm going to do that is we're going to type if roll is greater than 3. Then the success will occur. You run away, but the orc is still chasing you. We move on to Orb Chase, but we will add our else. Once again, being careful about the indentations. If the choice is not greater than 3, game over. Let's see, what will our reason be? The orc is too fast. So you see what's happening here. If roll is 4, 5, or 6, you succeed. If it's 1, 2, or 3, you fail. Every time we run this program, we're going to get a different result. We won't know whether the success or the failure will happen. So now I'm going to go to answer B, and I'm going to do the same thing. You can probably see how we can give each choice different odds of succeeding. For example, we can choose if roll is greater than 2, let's say. That'll give choice B a higher chance of success than the other choices. But for now, I'm just going to make all of the choices 50-50. That means if roll is greater than 3, the player will succeed, otherwise game over. So we're just indenting that, so success happens when the roll is greater than 3. Else, that is, if it's not greater than 3, game over. And for the reason here, we will put the orc laughs at your feeble attempts to attack it. Now choice C will also have a chance of success, the same chance. And if the player succeeds, we will print, "You fooled the orc. It stops and looks in the direction that you point, giving you time to escape." If the player fails, then we're just going to indent this game over here. You are not as good of an actor as you thought. And there we go. Now before we try this out, let's have the program print the results of the die roll. I think that would be fun for the player, and it also helps us, the programmer, to make sure that our program is working correctly. And I'm going to do that separately for each choice. Print statement is going to start with a string, which will just indicate that this is the die roll. So I'm going to type roll, colon, and then with a comma, I'm going to add the roll variable. And I'm going to do that for each choice. Okay, so let's try this out. I'm going to try to run away, see what happens. I got a 2. That means game over. Let's try it again. This time I'll try to deceive the orc with C. Nope, no luck. How about B? There we go, I won with a 5. I ran away from the orc, and now I can continue the adventure. So I think you can see how we can apply some randomness to the rest of the program as well. I'm not going to do that today, but I wanted to touch on one last topic before we end things. So we have here a pretty cool adventure game, but in the beginning of the video, I mentioned the idea of a role-playing game. A role-playing game is like a story where the job of the player is to provide the protagonist, that is, the good guy, the hero of the story, the main character, in other words. The player usually gets to decide the attributes of their character. Usually, before the game starts, the player has the opportunity to create their character, and then the character will go on the adventure. Notice how in our game here we've been using the second person narration. That's the technical term. We've been saying you rather than I or he or she or they. You wake up in a strange forest, etc. So what we're going to do is we're going to give the player the opportunity to create a character in a very simple way. So instead of start game, we're going to make a new function that is going to start our program, and we're going to call it character creation. So DEF character creation. Now down here, in order to start our program, we're not going to use start game anymore. We're going to use character creation. So first off, we're going to ask the player to name their character. First, there's going to be an input. We're going to call it character name. So I'm going to type C name equals input. The input is going to ask the player, what is your name? Now we want character name to be a global variable. So we can just start the function by putting in global variable. That is global C name. Now the variable that this function is making is a global variable. I'm doing it a little bit different than how we did sword. I think this is fine this way. But usually if the variable is an integer and I want to start it at a certain value, I will define it outside the function. Next, I want the player to have a few choices as to what kind of person this character is. That is, what kind of attributes they have, what kind of strengths or weaknesses. I'm going to create 3 attributes. Let's say strength, speed, and intelligence. And we're going to have the player choose which of those 3 their character excels at. So first I'm going to create these new variables, strength, speed, and intelligence. I'm going to start them all at 0. By the way, this is one of the reasons why we use capital letters when we make variables. str actually means something else in Python. It stands for string. Strength is 0. Speed is 0, and intelligence. Now for our function, we do have to bring all those into the function as global variables. Now we're going to make a print statement which asks the player, are you smart, strong, or fast? And then we're going to make a separate print statement that lists the 3 options in a nicely formatted way, A, B, and C. So I've made A, smart, B, strong, C, fast. Now we'll make our input. This is the attribute choice. Now, if the attribute choice is A, what do? Well, we will increase intelligence by 2. That is int plus equals 2. Now we are going to do the same thing for the other 2 attributes. B is strong. That will increase strength. And C is fast, and that will increase our speed. Then, once that's done, we are going to start the game. Okay, so our character creation is set up. Now, what do these attributes do? Let's look at the first part of the adventure, start game, and I'm looking at these 3 options, and it seems to me like choice A involves speed, choice B might involve strength, and choice C might involve intelligence. So what I want to do is I want to increase the odds of success if the player plays to their strength. If the character is fast, I want to make it more likely for answer A to succeed, and if the character is strong, B should be more likely to succeed, and if the character is intelligent, then C should be more likely to succeed. So what I'm going to do is, for each choice, I'm going to add the appropriate attribute score to the die roll. So let's start with choice A. The first thing that choice A is going to do, so right after our if statement and before the print statement, we are going to put roll plus equals speed. Remember plus equals from before. This is how we can add to our variables. Here, we're actually adding another variable to our variable. So if speed is 0, then we will add 0 to the roll, and it'll remain a 50-50 chance of success. But if speed is 2, if the player is fast, Well, that makes the player much more likely to succeed. In fact, they have a 5 in 6 chance of success. So let's do that with the other two options. So for B is the strength option. So we're going to type roll plus equals strength. And then for C, we're going to put roll plus equals intelligence. Okay, so let's test this out. And if we can get a roll that's higher than 6, that would be pretty cool, because then we would know that our program is working. Okay, so we'll put in our name. And I'm going to choose smart, because all this coding has made me feel pretty smart. Okay, so let's choose choice C. That's the intelligence choice. And there we go. Looks like things are working pretty well. So we can go on here and apply all of these role-playing elements to the rest of the game. I'm not going to do all that today, but there's one small cool idea that I wanted to show you before we end things. If we go down to the riddle, it seems like the riddle should involve the intelligence attribute, doesn't it? But it's also supposed to be a challenge for the player. So here's what I'm going to do. If the character is intelligent, I'm going to remove 2 of the wrong answers, making it easier for the player to get the right answer. So I'm going to leave the first 2. I'm going to close that statement. And then I'm going to type if intelligence is less than 2. Then we are going to print these other 2 options. So it's still a challenge for the player, but if the character is intelligent, then it's easier for the player to get the right answer so that they get the experience of playing a highly intelligent character. Lastly, we had the player choose a name for the character, didn't we? We should probably use that in some way. That would be fun. And let's put it here, where the fairy talks to the player. We're going to insert the name variable, what we've called CName, into the statement that the fairy makes. So here's what we'll do. We're going to close the quotes first. After greetings, we're going to separate things with a comma. We're going to put in the variable CName, and then we will open the quote back up for the rest of the print statement. All right, I think my game is complete for today at least. You know what, I'm going to go ahead and name it Escape the Enchanted Forest. This is version 1.0, and I'm going to put my initials. Let's try things out. What is your name? Mr. Christian. I'm going to go with smart. Try to distract the orc. I succeeded just barely. I'm going to go in the cave. I'm going to pick up the sword. I have 1 sword. I will attempt to negotiate with the creature. The orc has taken my sword. Oh, the fairy. Greetings, Mr. Christian. How do they know my name? And there we go. We succeeded. So with that, we will leave things there for today. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you had fun and you learned a lot. If you did, consider liking and subscribing for more videos like this from the Levittown Public Library. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for me, feel free to email me at teens@levittownpl.org. You can find that information in the description below, as well as a link to my Python code, which you can download. And that will be expanded a little bit. I've applied the role-playing elements to the rest of the program, so you can check that out. And I am no expert in coding, so if you have any suggestions, if you've done anything differently, if you've expanded this game at all, I would be really happy to check that out. So I hope you will all continue your adventures in coding, and we'll see you soon.